This PowerPoint presentation will cover Semicolons and Colons Level 2, which is Chapter 17 of your Canadian Business English Text, 5th edition. Let's start by looking at the basic uses of the colon. We use a colon after an independent clause, introducing a formal list of items. It doesn't matter whether the list is vertical or horizontal, we still use the colon to introduce the list. Here we have two examples. In the first example, we have a horizontal list. Success depends on the following factors. And then we have a colon, ability, preparation, and hard work. In the second list, which is a vertical list, we have a colon after the introductory and dependent clause. This fall, we plan to visit our branches in these cities. And then we have the list of items. In order to use a colon to introduce a list, we have to be sure that the group of words introducing the list forms a complete independent clause. So you can see in the first example here we cannot use a colon because there is not a complete independent clause starting the list. The curtains we carry are in. These words cannot exist by themselves, there's no colon. In the second example, we do have a complete independent clause. The curtains we carry are in the following colors. And then we can use the colon and start the series. In particular, you cannot use a colon to separate a list that follows a verb or a preposition. In the first example, budget requests have been received from marketing, design, and engineering. You can see the preposition from introducing the series, and therefore we cannot have a colon before the series. In the second example on this slide, you can see that the list is introduced by a sentence that ends with the verb are, and therefore a colon cannot be used. Here's another scenario in which you cannot use a colon before introducing a list. When there is an additional sentence that falls between the introductory statement and the list itself, then you cannot use a colon. For example, employees to be honored are in the following departments. Contact them at once. You can see that sentence, contact them at once, comes between the introductory statement and the list. If that sentence wasn't there, you could have used a colon after the word departments. You can use a colon to introduce long one-sentence quotations and quotations of two or more sentences. So you can see in this example below that the colon is used after the word writes in order to introduce the long quote. I won't bother reading that quote and pain you with my voice for this entire slide. Now contrast that idea of using a colon to introduce a long quote or a quote with more than one sentence with the idea of partial quotations that don't interrupt the flow of a sentence. In the example, in a poem addressed to a woman he's trying to woo, Marvel speaks of Time's winged chariots hurrying near, implying that neither he nor the lady has much time for hesitation. You can see that the quote doesn't interrupt the sentence and therefore doesn't require a colon. The same is true for the second example. The province of Saskatchewan is sometimes described as the land of living skies. The quote, in this case, doesn't interrupt the flow of the sentence, and therefore a colon is not used. You also use a colon to introduce the second of two independent clauses if it explains, illustrates, or supplements the first. In the first example here, Milan has long been a mecca for fashion industry people. It regularly holds the most important fashion shows in the world. You can see after the colon that there is a clause that illustrates the first clause, and therefore a colon is used. Let's look at the second example on this slide. I dread the coming of winter. Every year it means slush, slippery pavements, and bone-freezing cold. What we have here is a second clause that explains the first clause of why the writer dreads the coming of winter. In this case, we would also use a colon to separate the two clauses. It's time to check your skill. Consider the following sentences and consider where colons, semicolons, and commas should go in them. In the first example, We plan sales immediately after the following holidays: Easter, Canada Day, and Christmas. Where should the punctuation go? This is an example of a sentence with formally listed items. There is an introductory statement that does not end with a preposition or a verb. In this case, we can use a colon in order to introduce that list. Okay, here's a second example. So read the sentence and consider what punctuation is necessary. In this sentence, we again have a list of formally listed items. However, the introductory statement contains a preposition before the list, and therefore we cannot use a colon to introduce the list. Okay, here's some more fun. In the sentence, for correct grammar usage, you should follow this suggestion. When in doubt, look it up. What kind of punctuation is necessary for the sentence? In this sentence, we need to use a colon to separate the two independent clauses because the second clause supplements the first. And here's one last example. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau once quipped that the government has no business in the bedrooms of the nation, thus signaling that sexual matters between consenting adults should not be part of the country's legal code. What kind of punctuation do you think should be added to this sentence? This one was a little bit tricky. Actually, no colon or additional punctuation is necessary. This partial quote does not interrupt the flow of the sentence, and therefore does not have any colon. I'd like to end this PowerPoint presentation with the same final word that ends Chapter 17 in your text. Semicolons are excellent punctuation marks when used carefully and knowingly. After completing this self-directed grammar unit, though, some students might be guilty of semicolon overkill. They might begin to string together 2 and sometimes even 3 independent clauses with semicolons. Remember to use semicolons in compound sentences only when 2 ideas are better presented together. It's time for you to move on and try some exercises for level 2 of this unit.